October 29, 1944. At 25,000 feet over the freezing, contested skies of Germany, Captain Glenn Todd Eagleston was about to intentionally break the aerodynamic limits of his own aircraft. Eagleston was a man who understood the value of working from the ground up. He had joined the military as an enlisted private at just 19 years old, turning wrenches and stubbornly fighting his way into the aviation cadet program. Now, at 23, he was a seasoned apex predator leading the legendary 354th Fighter Group. He survived the brutal, unforgiving airspace of the Third Reich through a cold, mechanical mastery of his machine. And on this particular mission, he was going to need every ounce of that knowledge to survive a fatal aerodynamic trap. In the vicious physics of the Second World War, a misjudged dive was almost always a one-way ticket to the ground. When you push a high-performance fighter plane into a screaming vertical plunge, the airflow rushing over the wings compresses. This shockwave effectively locks the control stick in place, burying it as if it were set in wet concrete. If you dive too fast and try to pull up a fraction of a second too late, the aircraft either slams into the earth or the immense G-forces violently rip the wings completely off the fuselage. Caught in exactly this terrifying, out-of-control plunge, Eagleston didn't panic. Instead, he engineered one of the most physically impossible aerodynamic reversals of the war out of absolute terrifying necessity. Before we lock ourselves into the cockpit with Eagleston for a high-G maneuver that completely defied the Mustang's own flight manual, do us a huge favor. Hit the like button to signal the algorithm that real, unfiltered mechanical history matters. And jump into the comments right now. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and let us know if you have a family member who served in the war. And if your family tree doesn't have military ties, don't sweat it. Just drop the name of your absolute favorite WWII hero instead. We read every single one to keep this community strong. Now let's climb to 25,000 feet over the Third Reich. Glenn Todd Eagleston was born in Farmington, Utah. He was a man who understood the value of working from the ground up. Enlisting in the U.S. Army Air Corps as a private in 1940, he didn't have the immediate, polished pedigree of an officer. He wrenched, he studied, and he stubbornly fought his way into the Aviation cadet program, finally earning his silver wings and his officer's commission. By the time the brutal high-altitude air battles of 1944 raged across Europe, Eagleston wasn't just another pilot. He was a leading force in the legendary 354th Fighter Group. Famously known as the Pioneer Mustang Group, the 354th was the very first unit in the European theater to take the new Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang into combat. The P-51 was a completely different beast from anything the USAAF had fielded before. It was built around the British-designed, American-manufactured Packard V1650 Merlin engine, a liquid-cooled powerhouse that gave the aircraft unparalleled high-altitude performance. But the real secret to the Mustang's lethality was its wings. North American aviation engineers had designed a revolutionary laminar flow wing. Unlike traditional teardrop-shaped wings used by older fighters, the thickest part of the Mustang's wing was positioned much further back, which drastically reduced aerodynamic drag. This engineering marvel made the Mustang incredibly fast and gave it the legendary fuel efficiency to escort heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But that same sleek, low-drag design harbored a terrifying dark side when the nose was pointed straight down. In a steep dive, the P-51 accelerated so rapidly that the airflow over the wings could approach the speed of sound, creating a localized shockwave. This terrifying aerodynamic phenomenon was known as compressibility. When compressibility hit, the shockwave completely disrupted the airflow over the tail elevators. The control stick would instantly lock up, fighting the pilot with immovable pressure.
For many young, inexperienced aviators, a steep dive in a P-51 quickly became an inescapable death trap. On October 29, 1944, Captain Eagleston was leading his flight of Mustangs on a combat sweep over Germany. His sharp eyes, scanning the horizon through the heavy canopy of his fighter, spotted a flight of Luftwaffe interceptors far below them. They were Focke-Wulf FW-190s, Germany's heavily armored, radial-engined butcher birds.
The FW-190 was a master of the boom and zoom tactic. It was heavy, rugged, and possessed an incredible roll rate. But one of its greatest defensive advantages was its ability to dive. When a Focke-Wulf pilot was caught at a disadvantage, standard procedure was to flip the heavy fighter onto its back and plunge straight toward the earth. The sheer weight and aerodynamics of the German aircraft allowed it to outdive almost anything in the Allied arsenal, leaving pursuing fighters hopelessly eating its dust or ripping their own wings off trying to follow. Seeing the American Mustangs circling far above, the German flight leader didn't hesitate. He snap-rolled his FW-190 inverted and initiated a screaming, near-vertical dive toward the safety of the German clouds below. Standard USAAF doctrine dictated extreme caution when following a Focke-Wulf into a terminal dive. The risk of compressibility locking the controls was simply too high. But Glenn Eagleston didn't become the leading ace of the 9th Air Force by strictly following the textbook. He shoved his throttle straight to the firewall, rolled his Mustang onto its back, and plunged directly after the fleeing German. The acceleration was instantaneous and violently aggressive. The massive Packard Merlin engine roared as gravity grabbed the 9,000-pound American fighter. The airspeed indicator needle swept rapidly past 350, then 400, then 450 miles per hour. The aerodynamic roar outside the cockpit grew completely deafening. Eagleston was rapidly closing the distance, his eyes locked on the sleek gray silhouette of the FW-190 plummeting like a stone below him. But he was running out of sky. At over 450 miles per hour, the air flowing over the Mustang's laminar wings hit the critical Mach number. Compressibility violently seized the aircraft. The control stick in Eagleston's right hand turned to solid rock. The German pilot, knowing exactly how his own aircraft handled in a dive, seamlessly began his pullout, utilizing the heavy, rugged elevators of the FW-190 to smoothly level off just thousands of feet above the ground. Eagleston realized with terrifying clarity that he had drastically misjudged the geometry of the pursuit. He was diving far too fast, carrying a massive surplus of kinetic energy. If he didn't pull out immediately, he would bury his Mustang 6 feet deep in the European dirt. But his control stick was jammed, locked in the invisible, crushing grip of the transonic shockwave. He was plunging toward the earth, completely out of control, right into the crosshairs of a fatal aerodynamic trap. When an aircraft weighing over 9,000 pounds is pointed straight at the earth and accelerating past 450 miles per hour, the pilot is no longer flying an airplane. He is riding a falling ballistic missile. Inside the freezing cockpit of his North American P-51 Mustang, Captain Glenn Todd Eagleston was caught in the terrifying grip of Mach. As he chased the diving FW-190 toward the German countryside, the airflow rushing over the thickest part of his Mustang's laminar flow wings had locally exceeded the speed of sound. This created a massive, invisible shockwave. The aerodynamic center of lift aggressively shifted backward, forcing the nose of the Mustang to pitch down even steeper. The shockwave completely blanketed the tail section in turbulent, dead air. Eagleston pulled on the control stick with his entire upper body strength, his biceps burning, but the elevators were utterly useless. The stick felt like it had been welded to the floorboards. He was falling at thousands of feet per minute, and the green patchwork of the European landscape was expanding in his windscreen at a horrifying rate. The German pilot in the FW-190 below him had already initiated his pullout. The Butcher Bird was a master of this exact maneuver. Its heavy, rugged elevator controls and differing wing aerodynamics allowed it to maintain pitch authority in a high-speed plunge. The German ace smoothly leveled out, preserving his massive kinetic energy, fully expecting the American to either plow directly into the dirt or snap his own wings off trying to recover. But Eagleston was an apex predator who understood the deep mechanical secrets of his machine. If he couldn't use the control stick, he had to change the aerodynamics of the airplane itself. First, he immediately snatched the throttle back, cutting the roaring Packard Merlin engine to idle. He had to stop accelerating. Second, he reached for the elevator trim wheel on the left side of the cockpit. The trim tabs were tiny, hinged sections on the trailing edge of the main elevators, normally used to make microscopic adjustments to level the aircraft during a long cruise. At 450 miles per hour, winding the trim wheel backward was an incredibly dangerous gamble. If he applied too much nose-up trim, the moment the aircraft hit the thicker air at lower altitudes and the shockwave dissipated, the Mustang would violently snap its nose up with such extreme G-force that the wings would shear cleanly off the fuselage. Eagleston carefully rolled the trim wheel backward, fighting the panic that screamed at him to yank it all the way. As the altimeter unwound past 10,000 feet, the atmosphere thickened. The denser air created drag, acting as a massive aerodynamic brake. The speed indicator needle trembled and slowly began to drop. Suddenly, the violent shuddering vibration of the transonic shockwave vanished. The dead air over the tail cleared. The control stick in Eagleston's hand violently jerked to life.
The nose of the Mustang bit into the dense air and began to pull up. The G-forces hit Eagleston like a falling anvil, instantly multiplying his body weight. The blood drained from his brain, narrowing his vision into a dark, suffocating tunnel. The metal spars of the Mustang's wings shrieked in mechanical agony as the aircraft fought to redirect its massive downward momentum into horizontal flight. Eagleston bottomed out his dive just hundreds of feet above the German treetops, the roar of his engine tearing through the countryside. He had survived the dive, but he had completely surrendered his tactical position. The German ace, watching the Mustang miraculously pull out of the fatal plunge, didn't run. Seeing that the American had bled off a massive amount of speed and was staggering under the extreme G-load, the F-190 pilot banked hard. He used his retained energy to pull his heavy fighter into a tight, sweeping horizontal turn, looking to effortlessly slide onto Eagleston's 6 o'clock and blow the P-51 to pieces with his 20mm cannons. The tactical math was entirely against the American. Eagleston was flying too fast to execute a tight turn using only his elevators. If he hauled back on the stick at this speed, the Mustang would simply carve a massive wide arc across the sky, leaving him perfectly exposed to the Germans' guns. To survive, Eagleston needed to instantly, violently shrink his turning radius. He needed to invent a maneuver that defied the Mustang's own high-speed flight manual. His left hand dropped away from the throttle and grabbed the flap handle. Flaps are designed to be used at low speeds, typically under 150 miles per hour, to generate extra lift during takeoff and landing. Deploying them at high combat speeds was strictly forbidden by the engineers at North American Aviation. The sheer aerodynamic pressure of the slipstream was known to physically rip the flaps entirely off the wings, severely damaging the aircraft and usually resulting in a fatal crash.
But Eagleston didn't dump the flaps all the way down. He executed a split-second, perfectly calculated mechanical gamble. He dropped the flaps exactly 10 degrees. This is known as the combat flap setting. At over 300 miles per hour, dropping the flaps even a fraction of an inch instantly changed the entire aerodynamic profile of the laminar flow wing. It aggressively increased the camber, the curve of the wing, creating a massive sudden spike in raw lift. The heavy American fighter violently shuddered as the flaps bit into the 300-mile-per-hour slipstream. Eagleston simultaneously hauled the control stick all the way back into his lap and stomped on his rudder pedal. What happened next defied the German pilot's entire understanding of physics. Instead of flying in a wide, sluggish arc, the Mustang practically pivoted in midair. The 10 degrees of flap allowed the P-51 to violently bite into the atmosphere, hauling its nose around in an incredibly tight, high G turn that simply should not have been possible at that airspeed. The German ace, already committed to his own intercept trajectory, watched in absolute horror as the American fighter seemingly broke the laws of aerodynamics. The FW-190 was a brilliant machine, but it could not replicate that maneuver. When the German pilot desperately yanked back on his own stick to try and match the impossibly tight turn, the heavy Focke-Wulf violently protested. The FW-190 exceeded its critical angle of attack, the airflow separated from its wings, and the German fighter violently snapped into a high-speed aerodynamic stall. When a fighter pilot violently yanks his control stick backward at over 300 miles per hour, he demands an immediate, massive surge of lift from his wings. But the laws of fluid dynamics are absolute and unforgiving. If the pilot demands too much lift too quickly, the smooth airflow rushing over the wings separates, detaching from the metal in a chaotic swirl of dead turbulence. This is called an accelerated stall or a high-speed stall, and the German ace in the Focke-Wulf FW-190 had just flown directly into one. The German pilot had attempted to match the impossible violently tight turning radius of Glenn Eagleston's P-51 Mustang. He didn't know that Eagleston had dropped his flaps exactly 10 degrees, a mechanical trick that artificially increased the curvature of the Mustang's laminar flow wings, granting the heavy American fighter an unnatural, sudden spike in raw lift. When the Focke-Wulf 190 pilot hauled back on his own heavy control stick to stay on Eagleston's tail, the butcher bird exceeded its critical angle of attack. The airflow over the German's right wing violently separated. In a fraction of a microsecond, that wing lost all aerodynamic lift. The heavy Focke-Wulf didn't just turn, it snapped. The aircraft violently flipped over, tumbling out of its controlled trajectory and plunging into a vicious high-speed spin. The hunter had instantly become helpless. Inside the freezing cockpit of his Mustang, Captain Eagleston was enduring his own physical nightmare. The G-forces generated by his flap-assisted maximum performance turn were actively crushing him into his armored seat. His jaw was locked, his anti-G suit was fully inflated, and the metal airframe of his aircraft was shrieking under the immense, unnatural stress. Deploying flaps at that speed meant the hydraulic linkages and steel hinges in the Mustang's wings were taking thousands of pounds of sheer, tearing force. If Eagleston had dumped the flaps to 20 degrees, the slipstream would have ripped them completely off, throwing the P-51 into a fatal asymmetric roll. But his 10-degree gamble held perfectly. As the Focke-Wulf snapped out of control, Eagleston effortlessly bled off his remaining excess speed and rode the tight turn all the way around. In a matter of seconds, he had reversed the entire geometry of the dogfight. He was no longer the prey plummeting toward the earth. He was sitting directly above the stalling German fighter. Eagleston retracted his combat flaps, returning his wings to their sleek, low-drag profile, and pointed the nose of his heavy fighter down. The German pilot was desperately fighting his rudder pedals and control stick, trying to break the FW-190 out of its violent spin. He was an incredibly skilled veteran, and he managed to catch the heavy fighter, arresting the spin and leveling the nose just a few thousand feet above the European treetops. But it was too late. He had bled off all of his kinetic energy to recover from the stall. He was flying slow and level, a dead man in the crosshairs. Eagleston dropped into his 6 o'clock. He didn't need to calculate a complex deflection angle or guess the required lead. He let the internal gyroscopes of his K-14 computing gun sight settle for a fraction of a second. The sleek gray silhouette of the FW-190 perfectly filled the glowing reticle on his armored glass. Eagleston squeezed the trigger on his control stick. The 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the Mustang's wings erupted, unleashing a deafening synchronized torrent of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. At that close range, the concentrated wall of kinetic energy acted like an industrial buzzsaw. The heavy American rounds walked methodically up the Focke-Wulf's fuselage. They sawed through the unarmored wing root and smashed directly into the massive BMW 801 radial engine. The kinetic impact shattered the heavy steel cylinders, severing fuel lines and igniting the high-octane aviation fuel. The German fighter violently erupted into a blinding ball of magnesium-white fire, its right wing folding completely upward before the entire airframe disintegrated over the German countryside. Eagleston immediately hauled his Mustang up and away from the flaming debris, checking his mirrors to ensure the sky was clear. His breathing was ragged, his flight suit soaked in cold sweat. He had survived the terminal dive, broken the invisible grip of the transonic shockwave, and outturned one of the most lethal aircraft in the world by intentionally pushing his machine past its absolute operational limits. But the dogfight had taken a massive toll on the aircraft. When Eagleston finally crossed the English Channel and landed his Mustang back at the 354th Fighter Group's airfield, the ground crews were absolutely stunned by the condition of the plane. When they walked around the aircraft to inspect it, they found the aluminum skin along the wings was wrinkled and warped. Dozens of rivets had popped entirely out of their holes due to the massive, unnatural aerodynamic stress of the 10-degree flap turn. The flaps themselves required intense mechanical maintenance, their hinges stretched to the absolute breaking point. The aircraft had been pushed to the very edge of structural failure, but the engineering had held. This is the actual, unvarnished history of the combat flap maneuver. It wasn't invented by a panicked 19-year-old cadet who accidentally bumped the wrong lever in a dive, like the internet clickbait videos claim. It was pioneered, calculated, and executed by a 23-year-old apex predator who understood the aerodynamics of his machine better than the engineers who built it. Glenn Eagleston would go on to shoot down 18.5 enemy aircraft, becoming the leading ace of the 354th Fighter Group and a legend of the 9th Air Force. We don't do cookie-cutter history or cartoonish myths on this channel. The air war over Europe wasn't won by kids making lucky mistakes in the clouds. It was won by seasoned operators who understood the absolute breaking point of their machines. If Glenn Eagleston's 10-degree gamble gave you a new, gritty perspective on Mustang dogfights, do the channel a massive favor and hit that like button. It completely shorts out the algorithm and puts this raw, mechanical truth in front of the people who actually respect it. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next tactical upload. I also want to read about your local heroes, so dive into the comments right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from and who in your family served in the conflict. If you don't have a military family history, tell me which WWII aircraft you would personally want to take into combat. I read every single response to keep this community grounded in real history. Eagleston bent the rules of aerodynamics, and he lived to tell the tale. Keep your energy high, check your six, and we'll catch you in the next one.